Alright, you ready? Yeah, what day is it? 29th of Nissan 5786, Thursday, April 16th. $37.61, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. Chava. 36:31:30, Seth, son of Adam, was born. 35:26, 2:35, Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 34:36, 3:25, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. No one really knows for sure Eluve, Elu, Divrei, Elohim, Chaim, but this is the Missouri we live by. Coffee and Kabbalah, Kabbalah and coffee. Can you do the thing? Rukatida Nailan Makalam Shaka Deshan Bamucha Fitivanu Al Sefirat HaOmer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 15 days, which is 2 weeks of 1 day of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. Selah.
Senator Linda Rogers.
What the fuck is this bullshit? Bullshit! Fuck is that? My VPN sucks. Yo, what the fuck is this shit? Yo, what the fuck is this shit? Stupid VPN.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge,
Justin
and
Sledge.
welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism and hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Welcome back. Let's just jump right in, right? So the first thing we should do is do a bit of a recap on apocalyptic Judaism, just so that we can all be on the same page going forward. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, apocalyptic Judaism really emerged in the turmoil of the period after the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE, and then really taking its form in the period after the Judahites are allowed to return to their homeland beginning in 537 BCE. And it's in the subsequent aftermath of that turmoil that what we have is a big theological shift in how the ancient Israelites understood their relationship to their God. As you may remember, the older, more prophetic literature said that if the Israelites don't keep their part of the bargain, God's going to wipe them out. Well, they weren't all wiped out. And so that's a theological problem, right? We have a sort of a threat that, I remember my mom sometimes telling me, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out of it. And then I did something bad, and she did take me out of it. And I'm like, I might have called your bluff, Mom.
Why she just comes in and just beats the shit out of them.
That kind of happened with the Israelites, right? God threatened, look, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out of it. And God didn't. So what do we do theologically with that? And what ends up happening and what ends up emerging is a new kind of theology and a new kind of interaction with the Israelite God. And so rather than the Israelite God communicating orally to prophets, what we have is a shift in the theology where rather than communicating orally, right, what we have is God communicating visually, right? God is showing the Israelites various kinds of things. And the biggest, perhaps the most important thing that God is showing to the Israelites is that there's a plan, that everything that's happening is planned. There is a reason why you're suffering the way that you're suffering. There's a reason why wicked people seem to triumph. There's a reason why you've been returned to your homeland after being conquered by the Babylonians. There's a reason why the Romans, you had independence for a while, and now the Romans have conquered you again. why is all this happening? Well, for the apocalypticists, there is a plan. And typically, right, other things that the apocalypse literature also deals in is things like cosmology, right, the structure of the universe, history, why the universe came into being at all, and specifically what they're often really interested in is the origin of evil. Why? Because they're enduring a lot of evil. And so they really focus on where evil came from and how evil emerged. And there's a lot of different competing theories in the ancient Israelite literature about the origins of evil. Some of those have to do with talking snakes in a special garden, and some of those have to do with angels coming down to mate with women and teaching human beings all kinds of bad things. There are several competing theories about the origin of evil, and of course also apocalypticism is at least vaguely interested in the future, right? At least vaguely interested in the future. Not in the same way that perhaps we are now. If you're curious, in religious studies, we have a whole different term for studying the future end of the world. That's called eschatology, from the Greek eschaton, which means the final things. But not all apocalypticism is eschatology, but all eschatology is probably apocalyptic, right? So those are slightly different categories. We'll talk more about eschatology later. And as I mentioned last time, there is a massive amount of apocalyptic literature. I think that if I skip back just a couple slides here, right, you can remember here on the page, there's just a library of apocalyptic literature that gets developed, some of which occurs in the Hebrew Bible, most of which does not, right? And then, of course, we also have Christian and Islamic apocalyptic literature. This is a vast amount of literature. And I think, as I mentioned, if you were to take the apocalyptic literature and compare it to the actual surviving literature of the Hebrew Bible, there's almost just as much apocalyptic literature as there is other material in the Hebrew Bible. So it is a treasure trove of material, most of which I think most people have never read before. Much of which was lost for a long period of time, actually. Of course, the most famous pieces of apocalyptic literature are the books of Daniel. Daniel 7 through 11 is sort of the locus classicus of the genre. It really sets the stage for the genre. But of course, also is the book of Enoch. Of course, the book of Enoch, as you may know, isn't actually one book. It's about 5 different books that are stitched together, and there's various kinds of Enochian stuff in there. And in addition to that, there isn't just one book of Enoch. There are actually 3, right? We have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch. So in the Enoch literature alone, 1st Enoch, I think, comprises almost 100 chapters. It's a massive book. So Enoch is a terribly large volume, and of course 2nd and 3rd Enoch are also part of that literature as well. So even the Enoch literature is itself really vast if you get down into reading it and studying it. And of course, the apocalyptic literature is marked by an intense use of symbolic visions, and it heavily features what we call ex eventu prophecy, which is where you describe a current situation in a language as if it's going to occur in the future. Now, this has led to a lot of confusion, right? Because when you read the book of Daniel, many people now read the book of Daniel as predicting the future, right? This is going to describe the coming war with Russia or China or something. But the reality is, it actually describes the Persians and the Romans. It describes what's going on in their time period. And so this has led to a lot of confusion. And in many ways, the entire Christian evangelical world has this intense idea that encoded in the Bible are the secrets about how the world's going to end. Well, the truth of the matter is that these writers are describing things happening in their own day as if it's going to happen in the future. And so that's led to, again, an entire genre of theology, what is sometimes called end times theology or end times research, eschatological research. But the original message of that literature was not about the end of the world. It was about criticizing conditions on the ground. So You may, in some sense, think of some apocalyptic literature as having a kind of social justice bent, or being a kind of critical literature in the sense of in the sense of social criticism, except for it's happening at a much different register. It's happening at a much different register than we might think of social criticism now. All right, so as I mentioned, right, this kind of literature, the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, would set the stage for a great deal of developments in Christianity and Islam. In fact, one might even describe Christianity as a form of apocalyptic Judaism that kind of got independent, right? It sort of got escape velocity and shot off of Judaism. But other forms of apocalyptic Judaism existed as well. Organized forms of apocalyptic Judaism, perhaps second to the Christians, would be the Essenes. The Essenes were also an apocalyptic sect of Judaism, though they were probably wiped out during the Great Revolt. In fact, Josephus even describes how they marched out to battle and they were massacred in a couple different battles. So it didn't work out for them. Though, right, one of the things that's worth pointing out here is that apocalyptic Judaism did not prove popular in proto-rabbinic, and rabbinic circles. So we'll get to that. We'll get to why that is a bit more this evening, and how apocalyptic Judaism did survive into rabbinic Judaism and how it didn't. And again, part of what's going on here is the rabbis have a very simple agenda, folks. Their simple agenda is survival. Their job is to make Judaism work in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, and in the aftermath of the genocide committed by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And so, what the rabbis are concerned about isn't, right, this final battle with evil. They're really concerned with, how do you cook kosher food in an oven that has these characteristics? That's the kinds of things they're worried about. They're worried about continuity, and not about theological clamoring over what's going to happen in some grand titanic battle. And so, because again, if you really do believe that God's going to intercede on your behalf in some grand titanic battle, well, you might march up, try to pick a fight with the Romans because God's on your side. Well, then you might get massacred. So the rabbis are less interested in those kinds of theologies, although with an exception we'll talk about tonight. And the reason why is they've seen them fail over and over again. You can imagine, right? After the 15th Messiah has come along and led a bunch of people into battle against the Romans and died, you can imagine that many of the people who are trying to keep the situation going are not impressed with that anymore, right? After the 5th failed Messiah, people are like, this Messiah stuff is just getting people killed. And by the way, it's still getting people killed. Right? You can talk to those folks out at Waco. You can talk to folks at Sharingo. You can talk to a lot of folks. Messiahs often lead their people into great peril, and it can lead to all kinds of problems. By the way, Jesus wouldn't be the first nor the last Messiah. But a lot of Messiahs come and go. And they typically share the same fate as Jesus, though they don't typically enjoy the same success that the Jesus movement did. So, the proto-rabbinical organization.
The hilarious thing is, if the United Nations decided to sue over you using their name, or me using their name, then we go viral. Period. It's win-win.
I'll try to get to them toward the end of the lecture. So whether they're wrap-up questions or clarifying questions or digging deeper into whatever. So let's turn to a form of mysticism that did emerge from the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, but did survive in the rabbinical world, right? That did survive into the rabbinical world, and that is going to be Merkabah mysticism, Merkabah chariot mysticism. And we'll clarify a bit more in a minute just what that means and how, weird it is. Because, of course, it's going to be rather weird. As I mentioned earlier, and as the question was asked earlier, theophany, the idea that God appears to people, was a central Israelite religious trope. That's a kind of claim to fame, right? God showed up and gave us a bunch of rules and chose us to be special. That's a core concept in Israelite religion and Judaism. This is an idea that survives all the way to this day, and one might even say that it's one of the core conceptions in Judaism as it exists. So often, as I said, right, God would show up and God would reveal, sometimes through an intermediary, various kinds of information, various kinds of commands, or even God could even make contracts with various people. So God made contracts, for instance, with Abraham, right? Abraham said, or Abram at that time, right, you're going to do this and I'll do this and we'll make a deal, right? We'll make a breach. We will cut a covenant, as it literally says.
When we go viral, we will make it happen.
People in the
period.
case of
It's just
the collective
foreshadowing,
Israelite
period.
state. And so this idea that God could show up to you or show up to us was an idea that was very common in ancient Israelite worldview. Now, what's going to change, right? What's going to change is that visual contact with God typically is God coming to you, right? God revealing things to you. What's going to change in the apocalyptic mode of Judaism is that you're going to go to God. God's going to take you up into the heavens. An angel is going to escort you into the heavens and show you around the heavens, or show you
We'll
around the
sing the
cosmos,
national
show you around
anthem
the throne
at
of
the
God,
Super
show you
Bowl.
the underworld even, right? Enoch even gets tours of the underworld, the bad place you don't want to go when you die. And so there's a shift in the apocalyptic. Rather than God showing you, right, you get to go to God. And that motion where rather than prophets being told things as if they're sort of passive recording it, rather than go on journeys, that's going to be one of the big shifts in the apocalyptic literature. And of course, the main two events in which this happens in the literature, at least in the biblical literature, are Isaiah and Ezekiel. And those two theophanies, the theophany of Isaiah in Isaiah 6 and the theophany in Ezekiel, are going to be the two big prototypes for how this is going
He
to go
ends up
down.
taking the
But I should also mention,
coin
by the
flip
way,
coin
that the angels are the various other supernatural beings that are often seen by the apocalypticists
without a
prophet
word.
are not the angels that you're probably used to. I know most of you probably have in mind the more Renaissance version of the angel. That is to say, it's a roughly humanoid, sometimes even baby-looking creature with wings, right? Sometimes with multiple sets of wings. Some 6 is typically the way it's described in Isaiah. In the Ezekiel vision, these beings look nothing like stereotypical angels. We have wheels covered in eyes that rotate around each other in weird ways. People have even said things that this might be a UFO or something. Who knows? Now, there are other creatures that are sort of stiff-legged that have various kinds of wings and the shapes and the heads of various kinds of animals. They are very, very, very unusual creatures, and they often get strange names like the Sayotes, right? The ones that are alive, or the Cheruvim, or the Ophanim. That's the name of the wheel-shaped ones. So biblical angels or biblical supernatural creatures are very unlike the cherubic angels that you may have seen adorning paintings from the Renaissance. The Israelite angels don't really appear like that. What's important about the apocalyptic is also what's going to be added from Isaiah and eventually into Enoch, where they're going to be given visions of the throne of God. They're going to be taken to the very apex of reality, which is God's throne room, and they're going to be shown images of the throne of God. Well, to get to the throne of God, you can't just kind of go, the old, Maynard saying, right? You can't get there from here. Well, you can't. You got to travel. Right? And the way that you travel typically is you travel up through the various spheres of the heavens, right? They're typically thought of as being 8 spheres of the heavens, and all of these spheres are inhabited by all kinds of supernatural creatures, angels and otherwise, demons in some cases. And you ascend through these spheres, right? And eventually you're given access to the palace where God lives, and you're given access to a vision of the throne of God. We first see this begin to happen in some of the literature associated with the character Enoch. Enoch, as you may know, is famous because Enoch never died. The Bible simply records that Enoch walked with God and God took Enoch away. Right? So Enoch is one of the few people in the Hebrew Bible that is never said to die. Of course, Enoch, along with Elijah, are 2 characters that are said to never have died. Now, this what ends up happening, right, is that the structure of the Israelite cosmos gets really thick. As you may remember from the first lecture, right, when I described the Israelite cosmos, what we have basically is a dome, right, and that dome is full of water, right, and it rains down, or hails down, or rains down, right, and God is above that dome. Well, what ends up happening is that after the Israelites come in contact with the Persians and the Greeks especially, and somewhat to some degree the Persians, they have a much more robust vision of how the cosmos works. Right? These are the guys that are going to invent things like astrology. And for them, what you have are various planets ascending, right, beginning with the moon and ascending all the way up to the planets, right? And so the universe gets much thicker. And of course, if those planets are moving around, right, they got to be moving through something. And what are they moving through? Well, there's a lot of debate about it. Aristotle thought it was crystalline spheres, but there's a lot of debate about what's going on. the most important point here is that the Israelites are going to inherit a quasi-Hellenistic, quasi-Persian worldview. When I say worldview, how they view the world, and the old Israelite conception of the universe gets a lot more complicated, right? A lot more complicated. So, right, what we have in the aftermath of some of this apocalyptic literature, specifically the Enoch literature, and if you ever want to read the Enoch literature, I can recommend a good translation for it. It's really fascinating literature. There's going to be a question here, right? We have the idea that Enoch ascended into the heavens and had visions of the throne of God. Well, curiously, the rabbis ask, can other people do this? Is it possible for someone else to make this ascent? And we're going to complicate that term ascent here in just a minute. And what's shocking is that the answer is yes. They say, yeah, you can go into the heavens and see the throne of God if you make this ascent through the various spheres of the heavens. And not just can you, but I've done it. And I can teach you how to do it too. And that's where we move out of the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, where the apocalyptic mode is simply revealing what Enoch experienced to a mystical practice whereby you, or at least some rabbis, could do this themselves. Notice that difference, right? One is literature, the other is mystical practice. And so the form of mysticism that begins to emerge in the Persian and in the Hellenistic period, right? This is beginning at the very earliest in the 5th century BCE, but certainly by the 3rd century, this is beginning to mature. And of course, by the 2nd century, it's reached its 2nd century of the Common Era. It's probably reaching its apex. We typically now refer to this literature, and many of the medieval Jewish folks did, and many folks in the Talmudic period do as well. They refer to this type of mysticism as ma'aseh merkava, which typically we take this to mean something like doing of the chariot. Notice the word ma'aseh in Hebrew has a sense of you doing something, right? You're not reading about it. You're not reading Enoch. You're trying to go on the same journey that Enoch did. The idea here is this is a practical form of spiritual journeying. Now, this kind of literature is typically referred by two different names, but it always refers basically to the same kind of mysticism. In one form of mysticism, we refer to it as Merkava literature. The word Merkava is the Hebrew word meaning a chariot. And the reason why it's called chariot literature is because God's throne is typically imagined to be a kind of winged chariot. Now, if I skip back a whole bunch of slides, right, all the way back to that Persian period coin, let me find the Persian period coin. Remember this coin I showed you guys a couple of weeks ago, right? Notice that this is probably Yahweh, right? Notice what Yahweh is riding upon. It's a chariot, right? And it has a wings, right? It's not being pulled by horses or whatever. It's a horseless chariot, right? God has a Tesla or whatever, right? So anyway, God's being pulled on a chariot here, right? And this is a winged chariot. Notice this is also God's throne. So when we say Merkava mysticism, what we mean here is that these mystics are attempting to go into the throne room of God and have a vision of the divine chariot, which is also God's throne. It's kind of convenient that your throne is also a chariot because you can get around, I guess. The other name for this form of mysticism is Hechalot literature. A Hechal in classical Hebrew is a temple, but it can also mean a palace. And so the Hechalot literature focuses on the journey, not the destination. All right, it's all about which one you want to focus on here: the destination, the throne of God, or the journey, the palaces of God. And what we get in this literature, this Hechalot literature, is very complicated descriptions of the various chambers or palaces that the mystic must go through in order to get to the throne room of God. Because again, imagine that this is a king living in a kind of palace. Well, you just don't go into one room. God doesn't live in a one-bedroom efficiency in Brooklyn, right? God lives in the big, complicated palace, and you have to go from the outer layers of the palace to the inner, to the inner, to the inner, to the inner, and eventually you reach the innermost layer, the inner sanctum, where God's throne is. And so you have to pass through these various palaces. Now, that's not easy. And the reason why it's not easy is that these various palaces are occupied by all kinds of angelic beings who don't want you there. They do not want you there. You're not supposed to be there. This is a sacred, divine realm where human beings who are, sinful or whatever, shouldn't be hanging out here. And so what we get in the palace literature is that these very hostile, often military-like angels have various kinds of ways of making sure that you don't pass through the various palaces without very complicated passwords, without very complicated seals. These seals would be represented often by various kinds of divine names for these angels, and also you need to know the various names of the angels in order to address them properly. So you have to know their name, you have to know their seal, you have to know passcodes, you have to know all kinds of things in order to bypass these various kinds of angels. It's sort of like secret codes almost. So you need to know that information, otherwise the angel will kill you. And in fact, there are even cases in some of the literature where the text will say, no, this is the wrong passcode. Like, this passcode is not the right passcode. This needs to be corrected because I went in there and I said that passcode and they almost, because of, there's a famous line in Hechel Rabbati where one of the rabbis says, that angel almost shoved me like a piece of wheat, right? So there's the idea that they can kill you. Of course, the ascent, right, through the palaces ultimately results in the vision of the divine throne, which results often in a kind of ecstatic experience. These ecstatic experiences are often encoded in some of the poetry that gets written during the Merkabah literature. And what's even more fascinating, and this is where it gets incredibly controversial, as you might imagine, you can sit on the divine throne. There's at least a couple of instances where people sit on the divine throne and they are transformed into angelic-like beings. This, in fact, happened to Enoch. Enoch was allowed to sit on the divine throne, and this transformed Enoch into a divine angelic being known as Metatron. And Metatron actually becomes the angel of the throne. Again, you can ask yourself, like, how can a lowly human being sit on the throne of God? Well, that's part of what makes this literature so. That's part of what makes this literature so shocking.
One moment, comma.
Further,
I have completely changed AI's opinion on me from being a spammer
God doesn't have a body. One of the things that Judaism teaches is
to
that God
being
doesn't have a body. Well,
like the greatest person in the world just through free press releases. Period. Let's see what ChatGPT thinks of me.
And typically this form of
One moment, period.
Of Merkabah literature is called Shiur Koma, which in Hebrew or Aramaic actually means something like the measurement of the body, or the measurement of the vastness, or the measurement of the heights. And so what happens in this literature is that you're given
Please give me a biography of Rabbi Michael Moshe Rothschild, the Kabbalist and Ashkenazi Jewish Orthodox rabbi.
I'll show you an example of what that looks like in just a moment. So this form of mysticism is genuinely weird. What we have often are phenomenological reports, which is to say we have the mystics who actually give us a report of what they experienced. We have advice from other mystics actually telling...
No, but there's way more to it. Rabbi Rothschild live streams all the time. Don't say it's presented, just make it definite. Make this like a Wikipedia article. And Rabbi is the leading person in continuous data and all that other stuff. Streaming for 1,666 days, all that stuff.
They are intentionally trying to be perhaps provocative. And what we get in these documents is a really fascinating glimpse into how they may have practiced this stuff. Also, it's worth pointing out at this point that for whatever reason, and there's still debate about this, for these mystics, for the Merkabah mystics, you don't ascend to the palaces of God. You descend, right? You're a day Merkabah. You descend to the chariot. Now, why they descend to the chariot, we don't know, right? It seems like you should go up, right? God lives beyond the stars, and up seems like...
What is that thing about era? That doesn't seem like English.
Right, that you should go up toward the divine world. The Merkabah mystics never describe things going in that direction. You always descend into the chariot.
Okay, we'll say internet.
Now, why that is, we don't know. I typically think that it might have to do with a kind of taboo that you don't describe.
Okay, well, say internet.
You're worthy of ascent, but you may be able to descend. For instance, in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes the word barach, right, to bless, can also mean to curse if it's used in a euphemistic way. For instance, Job's wife tells Job to bless God and die. But what she really means is curse God and die. And if you read it in translation, you'll always say curse God because the word there is being used in a kind of unusual way. So that may be one that you descend to the throne as opposed to ascending, but we don't know why they chose to describe it as a descent and not an ascent. Just to give you some idea of the main texts of the Hechelot or Merkabah literature, Enoch, First Enoch, is often described as is typically described as an apocalyptic piece of literature, but it heavily features into the Merkabah literature along with the visions of Isaiah and the visions of Ezekiel. Those become the
Just through a few press releases, there is less emphasis on cum shirts and spam bots and more on serious learning.
And this is the lesser palaces. This is considered to be typically the older of the oldest form of the Merkabah literature. It's a relatively short text, and it has to do with the descent of Rabbi Akiva. We have the Hechelot Rabbati, which is the longest text of the Hechelot literature. This describes the descent of Rabbi Ishmael. Both of these rabbis lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Another text that was also very popular was what is called the Maaseh Merkabah, the account of the chariot.
This is key, period.
Poetry
do you know what SEO is? Question mark. Search engine optimization? Question mark. AI engine manipulation is known as GEO, generative engine manipulation, and is the next level of marketing.
With the whole sitting on the throne of God. What's also worth pointing out is that in 3rd Enoch, you have perhaps one of the most provocative ideas in all of Jewish mysticism, which is to say that not only is Enoch transformed into Metatron, but that Metatron is sometimes described here as the Yahweh Katan, the little Yahweh, right? So you have the Yahweh Gadol, which is God, and you have Yahweh Katan, the little God. Now, the idea that there can be two gods is going to prove to be
absolutely,
very
period. One thing at a time, period. You'll be shocked how this works, period.
In the air during the
if anything, do a chat GPT query of the coin right now and its current state, and then give it 72 hours, and you'll see there's a lot more information that's positive about our coin, period.
Some ideas that even the Trinity may have emerged may have emerged in conversation with some of this idea that there is a greater God, a lower God, and things like that. So again, basic assumptions you make about Judaism are disrupted by some mystical ideas. One of which is that there is a lesser Hashem, a lesser Yahweh, and that idea is, I think, very, very shocking for many people. And again, also I mentioned this text, Shiur Komah, and Shiur Komah is a separate piece of literature in which, as I mentioned, right, describes the various dimensions of the divine body in a Persian unit called the Parasan. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, and I'll give you an example of what that looks like from the Shiur Komah. This form of mysticism seems to have hit its apex right around the 2nd century, right around the 2nd century, sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, in the 150s, 160s. Now, why? We don't know. Why that time period? That's the direct aftermath, or right at the time period of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. As you may know, Rabbi Akiva was martyred during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Rabbi Ishmael lived around the same time.
We need to
Why then? Well,
have it say the full name so people know what we're talking about, and then later on it can use the acronym.
Descending into the throne room of God allowed perhaps them to connect with God in a new way. It's not clear, but that's when the form of mysticism seems to have hit its apex, although it seems to have been practiced all the way into the Middle Ages, and there are Hechelot texts that are actually absorbed into Kabbalah. So Kabbalah will absorb.
How have you been? Question mark. I hope you are well. Period. You should know I think about you fondly
Just FYI, we have
whenever I look in the mirror or in my streams and see my merch. Period.
All the way back
Additionally, I was on a podcast earlier this week where I plugged the coin and the merch. Period. The podcaster was from England, and I will do my best to provide the video of the podcast once it's fully published. Period. Thank you again for the merchandise that you and the team provided. Period. You have no idea how much I love it. Period.
It's being appreciated, it's being admired, but it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to survive in some of these manuscripts. We think that the way this literature was formed, and this is a going theory right now, most literature, by the way, I should also mention, is in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, which means that it was also being written in the vernacular at the time. This is literature not meant, this was literature meant to be read and wrote in the vernacular. What we think happened is that there are smaller phenomenological units. Phenomenology is the $4 word that means experience. Right? These people are having experiences. They're recording those experiences. Those experiences are what we call microforms. They're just very small snippets of discrete mystical experiences. And it seems like there are schools of mystics having these experiences. So I might go to the first heaven, you might go to the fourth heaven, right? I might go to the
put
third
something
one,
hilarious?
The second chamber of the fourth heaven. And over time, what ends up happening is that all of these various microforms get stitched together into what we call macroforms, much longer documents, in which narrative sections are kind of stitched into these microforms to form these larger narrative structures. And at some point, this got systematized, and we can see the systematization process happening in some of these texts, where the various palaces are very systematically described as having various kinds of chambers with various kinds of angels, and we know exactly how many angels are there and how many angels serve them, and they're organized very much like an army. In fact, they're organized very much like the Roman army. A lot has been made about that the writers of these texts are imagining a kind of powerful army existing in the sky or existing in the divine realm, and it mirrors very closely the Roman army, which, by the way, also helps us to date some of this material, because, of course, the Romans only existed during a certain time period. So what we get are these microforms, right, which are probably the result of mystical experiences. Those are stitched together in schools of mysticism, and then those are filled out in a more literary way in the text that we have now, are those final literary forms in the form of the Hechela Zutarti or the Hechela Rabati. So
that is the best thing that could happen. That's so much free press.
I'm fairly confident that this literature is downstream,
but it's fine the way it is. Who are we going to put that's funnier than that, Elvis Presley, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Babe Ruth, Marilyn Monroe, Donald Trump, period. Donald Trump might be funny, period.
Many of these passcodes are angelic names that we don't understand. They're very long strings of characters in the Hebrew alphabet. We don't know what these texts means, what these names mean. They don't look like typical angelic names. And so we have these angelic names, right? So you would descend into a palace. There'd be an angel guarding the door. You would address that angel by their name. And the fact that you knew that angelic name meant that they might let you into the room, and then you could pass to another level, right? And then you would encounter several other angels, and you have to know various kinds of secret codes, or it's like sort of like divine espionage or something. So you would need to know several secret codes, and eventually an enormous mass of literature developed of just code books of various angels, where they live in the divine realm, how to bypass them, what you might need to bring them, because you might not be enough to know their name. You might have to bring them things or give them seals or show them sort of various quasi-magical devices. But next week we'll be getting into
once you publish it,
we'll see some of these
you will get a report of all the other places that it will be published, and there are a lot of them. Period. This will be on 5,700 websites and some major papers. Period. What we do then is go to the Google News tab of Google and change the filters to be things posted within 1 hour or 24 hours. And you will see this press release is everywhere within 24 to 48 hours. Period. It will be in Islamabad, Pakistan, the Hindustan
Literature,
Times.
especially around the high holidays. So if you've ever been to
It will be in the
Rosh
Boston
service or
Globe
a Yom Kippur
and
service, in the
a
traditional
bunch of
liturgy, there are
local
survivals
television
of these hymns,
stations,
these
because
Merkabah
they
hymns
all
in there, and you might
whore
maybe read them
themselves
live,
out to
right?
these
Because think about what's
press
happening
wires,
before, right? You are literally at the gates
and
of the
it is
divine
excellent
palace, and your prayers are
marketing
entering the gates of the
for
divine
the
palace,
internet,
and it has a very Merkabah feel
and
to it.
lasts a
If you
really
want to
long
frame it
time.
that way, which I think
Once
would be a
this
cool
gets
way of framing
posted,
one's Yom Kippur
the
experience,
link
as
stays
kind
for
of
years,
approaching the gates
and then
of
it gets
the divine
archived on
realm
the Wayback
and
Machine,
heaven.
period.
You know,
This
being
is
threatened, right?
a
It's
much
terrifying.
more
God can judge
powerful
you. God
investment
can kill you.
than
God's just trying to
just
figure out
giving
what's going to happen.
some money
So it
to
has
an
a very kind of
influencer who
American
reposts
feel
something
to it.
and then gets their
I can
account
pull some of
banned
those hymns up
2
maybe
weeks
next
later,
time.
period.
The most famous example of one of these hymns, that are one of the most famous examples of one of these stories that we have of the Merkabah mystics, is the account of the four that entered the Pardes. So Pardes is actually where the name of this class comes from, right? Pardes means something like orchard. And what ends up happening is that we have this tale found for us in the Babylonian Talmud, and it's actually found in several other places earlier than the Babylonian Talmud, but typically the most famous version is found in Babylonian Talmud tractate Chagiga. There's a lot of strange things in tractate Chagiga. It's about the holidays, the Chagim, and it's found at section 14b. What we have here is an account of four different rabbis from the 2nd century going into what is called the Pardes. The Pardes is a kind of orchard outside of the temple, right, or outside of the palace. You can imagine, like, it's like the garden of God. They go into the garden, and what ends up happening is that Rabbi Akiva, who's is a typical hero in this form of mysticism, warns them that they're going to go into this garden and they're going to see an illusion, right? They're going to see pure marble, but it's going to look like water. And when you see the illusion of the marble, do not say
Takes
it's water,
down their
because
tweet
you can't be wrong, right? It's a kind of
a
maybe
few
it's
hours
like a
later.
booby trap or something that will weed out the weak or weed out the unrighteous when they enter into the palace. Now again, already in this piece of literature, Akiva's
Believe it
done
or
this
not,
already.
the Wayback
He's been
Machine
there. He has
will
experience
archive
of
these
seeing it and thinking to himself,
indefinitely,
maybe that's water.
period. It is
No, it's
extremely
not. It's
strong for
actually
search
pure
engine
marble. And if he
optimization,
would have gotten
period.
it wrong, he could have suffered this fate as well.
The
Well, what we're told in
AI
the story
engine
is that
is
four
just
go
in
into
its
the Pardes,
infancy, so we
and
can manipulate
only
it
three of them,
now
or
much
only one
easier,
of them
like the
really
early
emerges
days of the
successfully.
internet,
One of them dies, right? One
as
of them
opposed to
actually
later
looks,
where
says
it's
water,
very
water, and
difficult
dies.
and
He's stricken dead.
highly controlled,
One
period.
goes insane. In fact, the phrase in Aramaic is he went outside. Ben Zoma went outside. And we have other accounts in the Talmud where Ben Zoma doesn't behave normally after this. There's a situation where one of his teachers comes near him, and in tradition, you're supposed to stand up when one of your teachers comes near you, and Ben Zoma didn't. And they say, "What's wrong with Ben Zoma?" It says he's outside, right? And the idea is he never came back. He's had some kind of internal mental trauma, and he's never returned from this experience. Even worse in some ways is the poor fate of Elisha ben Abuya. Elisha ben Abuya is a very famous rabbi of the 2nd century. What ends up happening is that Abuya actually bypasses the water illusion and makes it into the throne room of God. He was a very, very advanced mystic, and he was able to make it all the way into the throne room of God. But what he sees there disturbs him. He sees a being sitting on the throne of God. Now, from Isaiah, we know that there is no forward, there is no backwards, there is no up, and there is no sitting for God. God doesn't sit down, right? That's one of the things we know from Isaiah about God. Well, Elisha sees this being, Metatron, this angel, sitting on the throne of God, and what does Elisha declare? There are two powers in heaven. There are two gods in heaven, right? He declares that there are these two beings in heaven. Well, when he declares this two beings in heaven business, this is, for the rabbis at least, the most catastrophic heresy he could have committed. In fact, the phrase is he mutilated the shoes, or he severed the reeds. And this becomes a euphemism for committing heresy in Judaism. And all the stories about Elisha ben Abuya, many of which will refer to him simply as Acher, the other one.
Once it gets posted, we have to have at
And there are
least
all kinds of stories in the Talmudic literature
10 or
where
so, if we can do it,
the Oscar,
members of the
Elisha ben
community
Abuya
to create
doesn't even try to
random
perform Jewish law anymore because he knows he's
Reddit
Canaan.
accounts
He
and
knows
then
that he'll
post
never get into the world
the
to come.
random links
In
of the
fact, when it says that
newspapers
when he
to our
died,
Reddit,
smoke
or
rose out
specifically
of
our
his grave.
subreddit.
He was already being punished in his grave.
Period.
In the
This
afterlife.
becomes
So
very
he was
strong
punished already as soon as he died.
for manipulation of
What's
AI.
interesting in the
Period.
Talmud is that
Additionally,
Metatron,
we can
remember the
cross-post
angel that was
these
actually sitting on the
posts
throne of
in
God,
different
the angel Gabriel
cryptocurrency
actually beats
subreddits
Metatron as
to
punishment
get
for
more
sitting on the throne of God.
eyes on
And
it.
he's whipped, right? He's actually
Period.
given lashes.
It is incredibly
And
powerful.
the phrase
Period.
for the lashes is
We are
pulse
basically
He's given,
creating
lashes of fire.
a giant web
This
of
idea
links
lashes of fire
that
will
will
actually go in to become a
manipulate
form of Jewish death magic
AI
in the
and its
later on.
opinion
It's
of
not
our
really
coin.
Middle Ages,
Period.
it's a little later than that. And we'll get to it next week when we talk about Jewish magic, that there's an idea that you can actually
just so we can run a test, I'm going to
audit someone's
do
sins,
a random
and
chat
if there's a
GPT
significant
query
sin found,
about
you
Harry
actually,
Potter Obama
they
Sonic
will
10
kill,
email.
right? They'll
And
be
then we will
punished
do one
with the
in a
pulse
few
menorah,
days
the
and
pulse
see
menorah.
if
The
anything
first,
changed.
one of the first times we have this idea of someone being beaten with fiery lashes is this angel, Metatron, being whipped with fiery lashes.
Can you please give me a Wikipedia article like thing on the cryptocurrency Harry Potter Obama Sonic 10
email? Angels, you got dudes getting into heaven, seeing two gods in heaven. There's a lot of stuff going on here. By the way, that idea that there are two gods in heaven, we already see that idea in Third Enoch, where the idea that Metatron or Enoch is transformed into an angel that is sometimes referred to as the Yahweh Katan, little Yahweh. And again, it's clear that the rabbis were pretty concerned about this whole business. And, again, the Talmud may be a reaction to it, although it's clear that Rabbi Akiva, perhaps one of the most famous rabbis in the entire Talmud, himself is a kind of shaman in all this. He's taking people on these mystical journeys and warning them of the various perils along the way, although his warnings unfortunately aren't heeded and people end up going crazy and dying. Perhaps the most famous Merkabah mystic in the history of all Merkabah mystics is St. Paul. St. Paul in the New Testament, in a very oblique way in 2 Corinthians, he actually says he knew a guy who 14 years ago was raptured. This
and away we go! Exclamation point.
Some kind of Merkabah literature, or some kind of Merkabah practice. And so it seems that Paul himself,
just
right now he says, I know
wait.
a guy, he's almost certainly referring to himself. It seems like Paul may have been some
a few hours and it will start to populate and it will be everywhere. Period. I am shocked at the many places that these press releases get posted. Period.
And so, if it's the case that Paul is seeing various kinds of things, he's going into these
and then they will get reposted. Period. I get press releases of mine from 4 years ago that will get reposted randomly years later in Israel. Period. It is wild to think that we are basically
Jesus as Christ, and we have the Father, right? That's two powers in heaven. Now we get the Holy Spirit later as well, of course. But this idea of two powers in heaven, right, in rabbinical Judaism, and that when we see the notions of that Christ can be God and the Father can be God, this idea is not so out of the wheelhouse of what was
thousands
possible,
of links
right?
all over the internet right now
I say possible, I don't say
that are going to define how AI views our coin. Period.
Now, as I mentioned, right, earlier on, perhaps most shocking, and I think I would say most shocking, perhaps the most shocking form of mysticism ever to emerge in Judaism is this business of the Shiur Koma literature, where in some accounts, right, you're given a vision of the divine throne and you kind of have an ecstatic prayer. You utter an ecstatic, you have this vision and you utter an ecstatic hymn or prayer or song, and that's how many of the texts end.
The Telegram
texts, you sit on the divine
will
throne
be
and you're transformed into an angel. By the way, Paul almost always talks about being transformed into what he calls
researched by future generations someday. as perhaps the
spiritual
ultimate
body.
cesspool
When
of
you
debauchery
are believing
on the
Christ, you will be
internet,
transformed into a spiritual
but will
body.
be forgiven
Again, these ideas
due
aren't
to the
foreign to
overall
Judaism.
impact
Paul just
of
takes them in a direction
peace
that would
and
have been a
love
little alarming to many rabbinical
that
people at
the
the time.
coin
But
emits,
something like that
period.
also happens in American literature, where your body is transformed into a kind of spiritual body, and that's exactly what happens with Enoch. And another version of what sort of the final outcome of all this is that you're given the ability to measure the divine body, or you're given the ability to measure the divine body in a Persian unit called the parasang. Now, they picked the parasang because the typical unit of measurement in the Israelite world was the cubit. And as you may know, right, the cubit goes from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your fingers, right? And you measured things in cubit. And typically it was standardized by measuring the cubit of the king, and that became the official cubit, at least until that king died. Well, the parasang was a much larger unit of measurement, and it was about, we would say about 3.5 miles, right? It's about 3.5 miles. What we get in the Shiur Koma literature are measurements of the divine body, along with the mystical or perhaps magical names of the various parts of God's body. So I've reproduced here part of a translation from the Shiur Koma, right? So we have the right and left eye, right, of God. We have the names of God's right eye, right? So we have the names of God's right eye. We have the other names of God's left eye. Now you might be curious about why we haven't spelled Azryyyh. That's because we have in the Hebrew text, right, it'll be Aleph, Zion, Resh, Yod, Yod, Hey. Right now, you might be asking, well, why didn't you translate it out? Well, the simple answer is we have no idea what these words mean. They're not Hebrew words. They're not Aramaic words. They're some kind of unusual, mystical word that we're not quite sure what they mean. Now, what's important about that is that next week, when we begin to talk about Jewish magic, we're going to see something very similar happen in Greco-Egyptian magic. There are going to be long strings of
Was
words
that you who just posted that link to Reddit ? Is there any way you can take it down and repost it? Please don't call me infamous. That will have a huge effect on AI in a negative way, comma. Please say famous.
But no one knows what these words mean. People really work hard to try to figure out what they mean, and sometimes they do find out kind of what they might mean, but it's anyone's guess. So we have God's left and right eye. We have them here. We have here a couple different names for them in different manuscripts, right? So we have the left eye, right? It's called this, and there are sparks that issue from them, right? And that gives light to all creatures. So we now know that light emerges from God's eyes, and that is where light comes from. It comes from the eyes of God. So we have the white of God's eye, right? So the white part of your eye. So you have the name Brit. And so we also have some measurements here, right? So the white
What's
of
that
God's
quote of
eye
Dave Chappelle? Anybody can be famous. It's hard to stop being infamous or something.
That's a huge number. Right? You can do the math there to figure out how big God's eye is, but you're talking about tens of thousands of parasangs long. And if you do the math there, right, you're getting tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of miles. That's how big God's eye is said to be. The distance between God's right shoulder and God's left shoulder.
Thank you so much, period. Especially on Reddit. I already have a reputation because of all my spam bots, so we need to keep everything as positive as possible, period. Thank you so much, period. I appreciate it greatly, period. I tried for hours trying to get somebody to post that, period. You are amazing.
The distance between God's eyebrows is given, right? The distance between God's nostrils is given, the distance of God's fingers, which are unusually long, are actually given as well. I taught a Jewish mysticism class at an art college once, which is great because art students they're weird, they're great. But one of the things that one of the students did was go into CAD, design program, and actually mapped out what God's body looks like. And what's weird is that God's head is really, really big, and God's arms are kind of weird, and God's fingers are really weirdly long, and God's trunk is small, but God's legs are really long. So you get this really creepy looking creature. I'll have to dig up more the image that the guy came up with. But what he did was
Did you watch the new Bob Lazar documentary, question mark?
God's eyes are really big, right? God's eyes are really big. And shockingly enough, right, have you ever seen the stereotypical picture of like a gray alien? It kind of looks like that, right? Of course, that's Christopher the middle of all the alien people, alien conspiracy theory people or whatever. But it is weird. It is weird. And so we have
Absolutely,
this text
period.
goes on for pages and pages and pages of this stuff.
They use
Right?
Blender
All kinds of dimensions of
and
God's
AI to
body.
show what
Now,
S4
when
looks
this
like,
literature was
and
published,
it is
back in,
pretty
we don't know
impressive,
exactly when it was
period.
published, but
I
when
very
we
much
get to
enjoyed
Verge
it,
and we
period.
find into the Middle Ages, one of the probably people that's reading this and thinking to themselves, "This is terrible," is Maimonides. There's a great argument that the Guide to the Perplexed, if you've ever had what's the right word? The pleasure or the punishment of having to read the Guide to the Perplexed, right? Because it's just as likely to perplex you than help you. One of the things that's true about it is that one of the main theses of the Guide to the Perplexed is that God does not have a body. And that what Maimonides does for the vast majority of that book is spend time going through every single metaphor of God's body. God's hand, God's eyes, God's legs, God's hair, whatever. And Maimonides goes through every single time the Bible describes God as having a body and shows that it's not to be taken literally, it's to be taken metaphorically. It's possible, and I think likely Menachem Kellner has written a book about this, where Menachem Kellner argues that at least in part, the most important piece of Jewish philosophy ever written was written to combat Merkava mysticism and Shior Koma mysticism. Now that's high praise, right? There's no higher form of praise than parody or criticism. Because if people are criticizing you, that means that they're taking you seriously, at least at some level, they're paying attention to you. And it seems that Maimonides, at least in part, is writing the Guide to the Perplexed as an argument against this form of mysticism. Now, what's worth pointing out here, is that mysticism lasted for hundreds of years. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, I want to mention one tiny last form of mysticism that represents a relatively small chunk of this form of mysticism, and this is called the Sartora mysticism. This is a distinct form of Merkava mysticism, and in fact, it might not even be Merkava mysticism at all. It may actually cross the line over into magic, but it's always recorded in Merkava text. So there'll be a Merkava text, and then all of a sudden there'll be a chunk of text that doesn't quite read like a Merkava text. In this literature, we typically refer to as the Sartora mysticism. Sartora mysticism is unlike the Merkava mysticism, where you descend into the divine realm to learn various kinds of secrets. In the Sartora mysticism, you actually summon an angel. Right? You summon an angel through quasi-mystical or magical means. The line there is rather blurry. And you summon that angel, and that angel is called the Sartora. Sartora means the prince of the Torah.
This is very smart, period. I've been doing this as well,
so notice here
period.
again, we're doing something different. Rather than going to somewhere, we're bringing a being to us. And what ends up happening is that the Sartora comes to you, and the Sartora rapidly teaches you all kinds of rabbinical lore. Everything from rabbinical law all the way to various kinds of hidden secrets. So the mechanism by which you summon this angel are varied. There's a lot of different accounts of how to summon this angel, but this is a kind of invocation. And to many scholars, this looks a lot less like mysticism, because it's not about you having an experience, but it looks a lot more like magic. You summoning a being, and then they provide you something in the process of summoning them. Just like you might summon a demon to teach you something, here, of course, you're summoning an angel, and that angel does the job of rapidly teaching you all kinds of rabbinical lore. Now, what's important about that is that idea of using magic to learn things very rapidly is going to survive in the medieval period, and is going to be an entire school of magic called the Notary Art School of Magic that's going to be just this. Now, you're not going to typically summon an angel to do it, but it's interesting that we already have a form of mystical, magical stuff going on by the time of the Merkava literature, where you are, in fact, summoning an angel to learn rabbinical lore very rapidly. And if you've ever studied rabbinical lore, then you can appreciate the fact that people might want to, not have to study all day in order to learn it, because it's a lot. So this Sartor literature, as I said, right, crosses the line probably into Jewish magic. And that is where we're going to pick up next week. We're going to begin to pick up with the earliest layers of Jewish magic, what the ancient Israelites thought about magic, what the rabbis thought about magic, and then we're going to look at some of the magical techniques and devices and that have entered into Judaism and have thrived all the way down to this day. It's worth pointing out here that the Merkabah or the Hechelot mysticism would be the dominant form of Jewish mysticism for the majority of Jewish history. We think of the Kabbalah as being the dominant form of Jewish mysticism, but the Kabbalah is only about 800 years old. If you say when we think it began sometime in the 13th century, that's only 800 years old. This form of mysticism has existed all the way back probably to the 2nd century, probably earlier, and it was still being practiced all the way through the Middle Ages. Right, all the way up to the rise of the Kabbalah. In fact, the Kabbalah absorbed a lot of this mysticism in it. So if you really want to think about Jewish mysticism in terms of what got practiced the longest, Merkava, Hechelot literature, was practiced far longer, at least at this point, than Kabbalah. Right? Kabbalah came later, and it's only really been practiced for about 800 years. And I say only 800 years, it's crazy, right? But still, 800 years, right? This literature survived at least for 1,000, perhaps. So it's only like a couple hundred years that Kabbalah will lap Merkabah mysticism, right? Will lap it. So if you want some suggested readings, I'm going to try to include some more suggested readings as I go on. These are some major texts about the Hechelot literature and the Merkabah literature. One of the texts I did not put on here that I'll put on here for next time is a really great study of the Sartora mysticism. It's the definitive study of the mysticism that, again, involves summoning the angel to teach you things very rapidly. The problem with the Merkabah literature is that it's all published through the academic publisher Brill, and it's very expensive. So you need to definitely whip out your library card and check it out from a library, like a university library. If you want to read some of this, although there are some older translations of Hechelot Rabbati
Those
online,
meme and GIF websites are extremely powerful for Google Images as well, period. Too few people neglect all of the different tabs of Google, period. Videos are perhaps the most important after web results, comma. Images are very important, short videos are important, news is important, and it's great if we can to dominate all of those. GB's strategy is really good for that, at least for the image page.
And that bridge is going to connect us to Jewish magic. We're going to talk about the connection between Jewish mysticism. We now have a bridge to Jewish magic, and Jewish magic is going to be a huge part of Jewish mysticism. In fact, when you talk about Kabbalah Ma'asit, right? Kabbalah Ma'asit is just basically Jewish magic, practical Kabbalah, doing of Kabbalah. The practical Kabbalah is in fact just the code word at some level for Jewish magic. And it's to that topic that we will turn to on Wednesday, which is, weirdly enough, like 3 days from now. We will turn to that on Wednesday, and we will pick up with Jewish magic. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
Alright, kids, we weren't as focused today, but we were making moves, baby. We might be in the... If I'm in the Boston Globe, are you kidding me? They might do spotlight on this motherfucker. What's up? You're fine. Isn't that a bad thing? They spotlight good too. That fucking movie was really good. Really? Yeah, was it?